So I think we'll get underway. What I want to do today is work through some data, and I looked at some of this data 2 years ago when I first heard that I was coming here. But more recently, I've gone back in and done some more digging to try and get a better, deeper kind of sense of what the information tells us about the Clarence Valley in particular. You will find, as some of you have just noticed, there are paper copies of the slides, and that's so that as we go through, if you want to make any notes, something strikes you as, wow, I better remember that. I'd like to, I want to raise that later, or I want to choose somebody's ear on parish council about that, or whatever. There won't be an exam at the end. But Robert will ask you to sing the key points of the presentation in plain song before you're allowed to leave. Okay?
That's a great plain song. None of this good boring stuff.
Keep it simple. Just go. So by all means, and because what's on there will be on the screen. Will be much easier to read because it'll be bigger. Okay?
It's a fantastic screen.
Yeah, squint at this the whole way through. So this is also partly kind of arisen out of my ongoing reflections and conversations with people around town and around the state as we think about how Grafton picks up some of the pieces, not so much as a kind of a engagement with the horrible events in Christchurch, but putting that aside and saying, okay, what happened back then has made us stop and look at ourselves. And let's try and get some data. Let's try and, instead of just going by the seat of our pants or the pit of our stomach or whatever, let's actually try and collect the data which is already there, because this is the data the government will be using and which also the Clarence Valley Council is using as they think about policies for us. So if we can look at the same data, we can say, well, we don't like that, well, that's great, let's encourage this, let's try and fix that. Or perhaps more significantly for us, so if we're trying to be a faith community which is compassionate to our neighbours, we need to know a bit about our neighbours. So we're not scratching where they're not itchy, and we're kind of addressing real issues that are actually in our community. So let's see how we go. So just to remind you, the marks of mission, and these have been adopted 30 or probably almost 40 years ago for the Anglican Church around the world. 5 marks of mission. One is, of course, to proclaim, and it doesn't mean words, but we want to share the good news of the kingdom of God, which is what Jesus was doing. So we're kind of in that business that Jesus was in. We're wanting to make disciples, so we want to teach people, baptise them, nurture them, so that they come to understand their faith. And it's core business for the church to be doing that, of course. We want to respond to human need by loving service. That's getting a bit closer to what we're going to be talking about today. If we identify particular needs in our community, then one of the questions becomes, so what do we do about that? Is it something we can do anything about? Or do we have to kind of encourage our local members in Parliament, whatever, to pay more attention to that and get it higher up on the kind of scale of decision making. We also want to transform unjust structures in society and particularly focusing on violence of any kind. So that will include domestic violence. It will also include other kinds of violence, and we'll see soon that actually there's a fair bit of violent crime happening in our community, and it's unevenly distributed across the valley. So there are some other social factors which are feeding into this, making some places more violent than others. And the final one is to take care of the earth and the planet, God's creation. And so remind, these are not Diocese of Grafton missional objectives. These are not Greg Jenks's personal hobby horses. These are the 5 marks of mission adopted by the Anglican Consultative Council in about 1984, when my hair was dark, long and curly. Okay? A lot of water has passed over the bridge since then. So just a reminder again, one of the ways we describe ourselves is that we want to be a generous faith community, centred on Jesus, seeking wisdom for our own lives, but also acting with compassion in the heart of Grafton since 1842. We no longer have any foundation members of the parish with us. We've been here a long time. In fact, I was reading something the other day. The person who was appointed to be the priest here was the only Christian priest on the north coast. So he had to kind of do baptisms and weddings and funerals from kind of Port Macquarie to Moolumbar kind of thing. That was his patch. You probably didn't see him at Christchurch across the road very often because he would have been out doing other stuff. Okay? So that's us. And this is where we are, of course, here in Grafton. And there's a photo from a week or two ago when the new bridge is slowly creeping out towards halfway mark. And of course, the division of the community into South Grafton and Grafton is because of the river. But then we were here when Europeans came. They came because the river provided transport and economic incentives to base themselves here. But the same river that attracted people here divided us into Grafton and South Grafton. And as we know, those divisions are still with us. Footnote, I heard after the service this morning that they have just announced last night and this morning that a new parish priest has been appointed at St Matthew's. Somebody from Newcastle, from the Central Coast. I didn't quite catch the name. Waghorn, okay, Tim Waghorn, and he'll be starting, I gather, around about September, October. So that means Brian is here for about 3 months, and then they'll have their new priest, which is great news for them. So the data we're going to be looking at is not only for Grafton, including South Grafton and this side of the river, but it's also for the Clarence Valley, because that's the statistical district that the census people work with. Okay, in very broad terms, there's approximately 50,000 people live in this valley. Okay, so and about 17,000 of them are in Grafton, both south and whatever you call this side of the river. So the whole of Grafton makes up around 17,000, which means there's 33,000 people living in other parts of the valley, particularly Maclean and Yamba, of course. So let's get into it and see who we have. So this is the patch we're talking about. So I said there's about just over 50,000 people, almost exactly evenly divided or split between male and female. 49.6% male, 50.4% female, and the median age is 49. Okay, across the whole valley. And we'll come back to that. Okay, we'll see some more on that shortly. There are 13,500 families making up that 50,000 people, and the families that have children, there's just under an average, you can't do this in real life, there's just under 2 children per family, okay, in households that have children. Okay, so it's not like one house has 1.9 and place next door has 0.10 or 0.1, but anyway. So what we said, this is even the families that have children, the norm is roughly mum, dad and 2 kids. That's kind of the statistical norm. So the days of the large family with a dozen kids, whatever, as we know, that's behind us. Okay? These 50,000 people live in about 25,000 homes. Now that straight away tells us there's a lot of people living in dwellings where there's only 1 or 2 people in the dwelling. Okay? The median income per household is only $910 per week. Okay, and the median mortgage payments per month are $1,300, and the weekly rent, the median rent, if you can get somewhere to rent, is $255. We have almost as many cars as kids, which says something about our values. To go back to this morning, says something about our reliance on private transport and our investment in the luxury of personal private transport as distinct from public transport. Now, there are all sorts of reasons for that. This is just, I mean, this data today is mostly descriptive. It's up to us to then say, we like that or we don't like that, and we're going to try and do something. We can do it by ourselves, or perhaps more likely, we can form partnerships with other community groups, players, to try and get some of this stuff happening. Now, we're not going to go through every single line of detail, but what I'll do with this one, I'm actually going to pull it down into a much tighter summary in just a moment. So this is just the age distribution for the Clarence Valley, for New South Wales, and for Australia. Okay? So take one obvious connection where we have, in terms of 0 to 4, we have slightly fewer children, percentage-wise, than the state or the country. But then we have a more aged community profile. So they're less likely to have bubs under 5 at that stage of their lives, unless they're called Abraham or Sarah or something like that. Okay? We'll draw back into some of this in perhaps a more helpful way in a moment. So this is trying to get the major age groupings, and I've highlighted in blue and red where there's a significant variation between us and the rest of the country. So typically, New South Wales and Australia, a bit over a quarter of the population are in their 20s and 30s. It's only like 16%, 17% here in the Clarence Valley. And if we could drill down, it would probably vary. There might be more younger people, say at Yamba, or maybe not, and fewer as you come back, whatever. We're just taking the whole valley.
Just adding those, over 50 is 45%.
Yes, well that's why.
50, and national is 30.
Yeah, you're putting all these together.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's great to have an accountant in the room. Thank you. I was getting there, but yeah. So what you're putting your finger on, Derek, is that we're missing, and this is stuff we know, and we see it in church, but we see it around the shops. We're missing the 20 and 30-year-olds proportionally, but we're doing really well in the over 50s, with a lot more people over 50 proportionally than in New South Wales as a whole, or in Australia as a whole. Okay, must be State of Origin week, say New South Wales, I think Queensland. So in the 0 to 15, there's not much in it. Okay, so even though there are fewer young couples here in the 20s and 30s, they're certainly keeping the baby production business going, because we're still getting a pretty close. We're not that different from the rest of the country. Okay, 5% versus 6%. Significantly a big decrease in the 23 to 49, 50 and above. Basically half of Clarence Valley is 50 or older. Okay. That can also be because it's a nice place to live when you're in retirement. I mean, there are different. This is just data. We've still got to make sense of the data. It's the good weather most of the time. I mean, even the last couple of days is way better than northeast Victoria. Okay, and drilling that down, just to collapse it down, and this is basically what we were talking about again earlier. 16% school age, basically, 28% between 20 and 50, 25% above 65, and the median age for the valley is 49. For New South Wales, it's 38, and for Australia, it's 37. And we're going to see consistently the data for New South Wales is mostly very close to the national data. So as a lump, New South Wales is sort of representative of Australia. The valley is a bit out of whack on a number of factors. I mean, amongst other things, it means we shouldn't beat ourselves up straight away about the lack of young families, because actually there's a lack of young families in the valley. So, I mean, we expect that doesn't explain the total absence of young families, but it does say, well, things have changed from the halcyon days of St John Edwards or Richard Herford or Bruce Schultz or whatever. Even though there are more people here, the profile of the people has changed dramatically. So family composition, we touched on this briefly earlier. We've got about 18% of the valley are single parent families. Now that will correlate with poverty and health and other social issues, not because single parents are not good parents, but the more difficult circumstances of being a single parent are more likely to correlate with other social issues that might bring in the education department or whoever. Okay. So basically half the people in the valley are couples in a household without children. About a third are couples with children, and about 20% are single parents. This is of the homes that have that are in the valley, the families in the valley. Okay. Again, we're talking about single parents, disproportionately female single parents, 80% mums, 20% just under, 19% blokes. Okay? So the single parent dynamic is also very much a mum on her own rather than a dad on his own, looking after children. So feel free to be scribbling down observations, questions, whatever, as we go along. Marital status. So, for those that are, obviously we don't worry about kids under 15, they're probably not going to be legally married. Okay, so this is looking at that proportion of the population which is over 15. 47% in the valley, which is pretty much the same. This is one point where we're pretty much on par with the rest of the state and the country. 47, 48% of people are married, 4% are separated, slightly different, but not much, and 11% are divorced. So we're slightly higher rates of separation and divorce than you would see across New South Wales and Australia, but not ginormously different. But perhaps the divorce rate is a bit higher. And also widowed is higher than the national and the state average. So we have more people that have been married but are now on their own, whether it's separation, divorce or death. Okay? And again, there's a whole suite of community and social well-being issues around that. Of the people who say they're married, of the population over 15, 40% are in a registered marriage, 11% are in a de facto marriage, which is about the national average, slightly higher than New South Wales, and about 41% are not married, and that's pretty much on par with state and national data. So no huge kind of surprises there, I guess.
Excuse me, Father Greg, where's the data from? What was that? What are those?
Most of this data is coming from the census in 2016, and it's accessible primarily through the Clarence Valley Council website, but also through the Australian Bureau of Census and Statistics. So all of this is publicly available information that anybody can access at any time.
I saw the abbreviations.
Yeah. Okay. Weekly income, you touched on this earlier. Average family, or if you like, average household might be more to the point. Average household income is only $910, whereas across New South Wales generally, and across Australia generally, it's just over, it's close to $1,500 per household in New South Wales, just a bit over $1,400 per household. So we're about $500 worse off every week per household than New South Wales and Australia more generally. Yeah.
That gets distorted a little bit though, because there's a substantial number of people who are on retirement incomes, particularly superannuation, which isn't taxed. So their actual real take-home income is somewhat higher. Although nonetheless, it's not going to change that. We are significantly poorer. But how the statistics are collected distorts things a little bit.
Sure.
For retirement
That
areas.
includes people on retirement income as well.
I'll take
Yeah,
pause for a
yes,
financial
yes,
analysis here.
But for most people, it's
Is this likely to include self-funded retirees and
there's no tax to pay.
people
There's
who
no
get
tax to pay, but I would imagine in the census they would have sorted out the income. But when we're talking about country towns, vis-a-vis cities like Sydney and Newcastle and Wollongong, higher weekly incomes, but double
the rent is more expensive, etc., etc. Yeah.
Probably double.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, so the cost of living may not be as well. We probably all assume the cost of living in Sydney is going to be higher than the cost of living in Grafton, okay. For example, or Maclean or wherever. Okay, but there certainly is not as much money flowing around in the system. Fortunately, some of the costs are down as well. I don't think that data gets picked up in this. When we look at occupations, this is just by category. So what kind of work do people do here in the valley? Okay. So about 15% of the population are professionals, whatever that will mean, presumably doctors, accountants, lawyers, maybe school teachers. That's a long debate whether a teacher is a professional or anyway, there's a whole, some of these categories are, well, profession traditionally was things like lawyers and doctors and priests, and teachers were not seen as professional. These days, I think they are. But who knows? Technical work and trade workers, about 14%, a bit higher than the average, whereas professionals is about, well, probably about 60% of the average. Community and personal care workers, remarkably high, and that probably goes with a significant aged care population and a significant number of work opportunities in aged care and also disability services. If you walk around the main block, I think one of my first impressions was that every block on both sides of the street, there seems to be some kind of disability services, community services, employment services provider. So there's a lot of work for people offering that kind of service in this community. Okay, which means there's a lot of people needing that sort of service. Labourers, 12% versus 9% nationally. Clerical workers, much the same. Managers, a little bit lower. Sales, much the same, 10.7, 9.2. Machinery operators, again, much the same, 7%, 6%. Okay?
But again, we're down in the areas where people are earning more money.
Yes, because the areas that are going to pay higher salaries are going to be the professional area, particularly, and of course people running businesses that are doing very well for whatever area they're working in. We're not a head office town. The other side of that coin, of course, is that you look at youth unemployment. I couldn't find, I've heard and read references in the paper and online recently. I just couldn't source similar data to use today, but I did find this graphic, which is looking at the country as a whole. And Coffs Harbour, Grafton, the youth unemployment rate is just over 23%, which is, and this chart only has the worst spots on it. It's not showing the national average, it's not showing the state average, it's showing the places in the country where youth unemployment is bad, and it's as bad here as it is in outback Queensland. But we wouldn't expect there to be many jobs for young people in outback Queensland, nor many people out there either. So presumably we're dealing with more numbers of young people who are finding employment particularly difficult to get in the Grafton, Coffs Harbour kind of area. So the Clarence Valley down as far as Coffs is a bit of a black spot. Okay.
Even worse than Tasmania.
Yeah.
Yes, it's even worse than Tasmania,
Because they
yes.
usually come up as being like
They do.
chronically bad.
Yeah. So there's an issue there. Now I'm sure if Sam Kent were here this morning, she'd be able to comment on some of the dynamics that she knows through her work with ETC, and getting kids into good jobs that are sustainable and are not just casual and part-time and intermittent and so on is one of the challenges. And that's presumably, after a whole group of kids have finished year 12 and they've gone off to uni in Armidale or Sydney or Newcastle or Brisbane. So they're not in these figures. And it's also after the kids that have found jobs in an industry where you perhaps don't need to have a prior higher educational qualification, but they're going to have career paths in business. And it also is after the kids that have gone off and joined the military. So even after you've taken those ones out, because they've gone off somewhere else to pursue study or employment, we still have 23% unemployment amongst young people. So that's, I think, for me, that's one of the most challenging bits. Yes, we have lots of older people, but it's not a good place to be a young person if you haven't gone to university and you haven't joined the army and you haven't found a job in a big corporation. Life's going to be pretty challenging.
Those figures would be even greater in South because whilst the average might be 23.3,
Oh, yeah.
something like 28 in South and 22 over here or something.
Yeah, and this is not even Grafton, this is Coffs Harbour Grafton. I mean, it's a larger, it's not quite the same statistical patch that we've been looking at. So back to the local stuff. So who is studying? Well, not surprising, we've got roughly the same percentages in preschool. Government schools, we have slightly a higher take-up of government schools and a slightly smaller intake of Catholic and independent schools. So there's in the Clarence Valley, public education is slightly more favoured than statewide or nationally. In other words, this is not a community where people are going to pay extra or are as likely to pay extra to put their kids through a private school as they do nationally and at a state level. So again, secondary, 15% government versus 11%, and the Catholic and other non-government slightly lower. Technical and further, slightly higher, but not much. It's still only 7.7%. There's not a lot of students enrolling at TAFE and doing trades and so on. And in terms of university study, not surprisingly, given that we don't have a university in town, and even a country university centre is not going to really change this much, we have very low levels. So whereas 16%, New South Wales, Australia, 16% of the population are currently studying at university, here it's 4%.
That's just terrible.
Yeah. And
Okay.
especially given these days when you can study online. It's not like you have to pick up sticks and leave town in order to get to uni these days. That's really woeful.
True, but having tried to study a diploma of Arabic online from Grafton, the internet is so bad. It was just some nights I just had to give up and turn the computer off because you couldn't do it.
So would those figures be inclusive of those who do their own thing online, studying online?
Yeah, these are people who are living in the valley,
Yeah.
not Grafton kids that are studying in Sydney. There's some people living in the valley who are studying despite the lack of a university.
Yeah.
They still manage to enrol by distance and do some study. Okay. Now they might be driving up to Lismore to attend classes. Wow, you do that a couple of times a week, you've blown a few days. They might be driving to Port Macquarie where there's a university campus. They're more likely studying online.
Yeah.
Okay. And so, in a sense, that's the one to call by. 16% nationally, 4 to 5% locally are doing university level study, whether that's a bachelor's or these days a diploma, associate degree, a degree, postgraduate work.
It's probably not relevant to what you're talking about, Greg, but quite a few years ago, without knowing the full details, Grafton had the opportunity of having a university college here, and the people who were supposedly had the power to do this said no.
Yes, one of the very first things I learned from Donald was that story.
Was it?
I was being polite and not mentioning that Grafton could have had a university campus, but our council said, as I was told it, we don't want people like that in our town.
The communists and feminists.
Well, guess what? We don't have people like that in our town because they've gone to Newcastle and Armidale and Sydney and Brisbane.
And certainly lower the average age.
Yeah.
Mm.
Not surprisingly, and when you look at, well, who is living here and what's their highest educational level of achievement, 10% of people in Grafton, if I can pull it up, 10% of people in Grafton have got a university level qualification versus 23% across the state. Well, it goes with the other. Obviously, some of the people working here have university, doctors, social workers, physios, clergy, accountants, teachers, whatever. They've all got university. So really, once you take all those people out, there's not too many others perhaps that have those qualifications. And the other one that stood out was year 12. Only 10% of our population is in year 12. And yet we've had normal age distributions through to about 15 or 16. Once you get to 16, 17, 18, our participation rates in year 12 drop off significantly. Okay, 10% versus 15%. And okay, so again, there's some not surprising challenges, some of which are structural. If you don't have a university in town, anybody who wants to go to university leaves town. I mean, notwithstanding the promise of technology, it's not quite delivered yet. If we look at cultural diversity, so we've got roughly 50,000 people, almost 51,000 people. 7.5% of them were born overseas, and 0.2% of them, just over 1,000 people, are people that live here in our community now, from Baryugal to Yamba, and who come from communities where languages other than English is the first language. So we're talking Sri Lankans, Indians, Malayans, Malaysians, say Filipinos, whatever. And in fact, the largest single group, around about 700, are in fact Filipino women who haven't come here to cut bananas, okay? They're married to old white fellas. Okay, so that's an industry. And there's about 700 Filipino women in the valley. They'll be almost 100% Roman Catholic. Okay, some of them will be Anglican, but very few. But there is a big Episcopal church in the Philippines, Anglican church. We look at that. So if 7.5% are overseas born, there's another 7 or 8% or 7% in the valley who are Indigenous Australians. So they're locally born, but they're more than locally born. They're the first peoples of the valley. And I don't think I have the data for Grafton, but my understanding is if it's 7 to 8% across the valley, it's more like 12% in Grafton and
12
South.
12 in South Grafton, 8 in Grafton itself.
That's interesting. So Grafton is more like the valley. South Grafton is about 50% higher. Okay. We'll unpack this cultural diversity or lack of in a moment. So in terms of the First Nations people, Australia as a whole, average of 2.8% Indigenous and a median age of 23. In other words, lots of families with lots of children, and families where older people die of diseases which would not kill white people. Okay, so the figures are pointing to some social dynamics. New South Wales, 3.4% Indigenous, median age much the same, which means the overall dynamics are the same. Lots of children, not many old people, because of kidney failure and cardiac disease and so on tend not to be treated as effectively. Clarence, about 6.4% on the data I was getting, 12% in South Grafton, and I couldn't find a figure for the median age.
You could be lower than
But I'm assuming it would be more like 18 or 20. But yeah, that would be the general kind of hunch there. Okay. In terms of locals and newcomers, and this is the data as at 2016, remember? So it's only looking at people who were born somewhere else. The vast majority of people in the Clarence Valley were born here. Okay, we have a very large local birth sample, and overwhelmingly those people are of British and Dutch backgrounds. Very few of them are Spanish or Italians or Greeks. In other words, it's not the Mediterranean, beautiful olive skins and brown eyes people. We tend to have populated the valley with Irish, English, Scottish.
Kiwis.
No, very few Kiwis actually. But this is very small numbers. I'm talking about the people that are born here. Kiwis are not people that are born here. Okay. So our Anglo population is overwhelmingly Northwest Europe rather than Eastern Europe or Mediterranean. Okay. So in this town, even the Catholics are Irish, not Italians. Okay, which would not be the same at New Farm, for example, in Brisbane. And I suspect not the same in Lismore, but who knows. So yes, so these are people that are born overseas. The grey is Australia, and the greeny colour, the teal colour, is us. And this is sort of percentage of the population. So percentages of 50,000. So somewhere around here it's about 0.5% of 50,000, which is not many people. Okay.
So what's with the Netherlands exceeding the Australian?
Well, because typically we're more likely to have somebody with Dutch background than Sydney is. But that goes to the point. Our traditional ethnic composition is British Isles, Dutch.
But what attracted the Dutch here?
In fact, there's already family here. There's some, but there's not that there's. I haven't noticed a Dutch club or any social infrastructure for people from the Netherlands.
There is a lot of Dutch here.
Yeah.
Dutch, yeah.
But bear in mind, we're talking. Where are we? Netherlands. We're talking about a third of 1%. We're talking about 100 people.
Greg, quite a few people came to this area from Germany. You know, if you look at the names,
Yeah, you can see.
Yeah, well, about the same as Netherlands. Yeah.
These are who goes.
we can't do that.
Yeah, these are people that have recently. These are the people living here now who were not born here.
Yeah.
So all those German names from the 19th century, they're locals.
Yeah.
They're no longer born somewhere else. The Schwimmhangers and the Kronerts and whatever, they're now locals. They're in the 85% of the population or the 92% of the population who were born here. Amongst the 8% of people who come from somewhere else, 0.5% of them come from Germany. 0.5% come from whereas in Australia as a whole, actually, it's also telling us Australia does not attract many Dutch and Germans. Okay? Because their economies are doing very well. Okay, there's no push factor at the moment to push Germans and Dutch and French and so on to emigrate to Australia.
It's interesting.
In the 50s, that would have been different.
There's no Middle East or
No.
No Africans apart from South Africa.
Well, you've got sort of South Continent, sort of South Asia, India. But notice Australia as a whole, quite a pull factor from India. In our valley, very, very few. And we do that. You walk around the shops. How many Indians do we see? How many Chinese people or Koreans or Japanese people do we see? If we do have people that have come from overseas, they're more likely to be from the UK or New Zealand.
A lot of people, many people, I don't want to say a lot, many people, I'm an English teacher, many people who come to the Clarence Valley, particularly Grafton, came from South Africa. Is that there?
Yes.
South Africa is here.
It's some.
Yeah.
But they wouldn't have been black South Africans, they would have been
No.
European South Africans. Yeah, I mean, that's just a guess. I don't have the data.
Yeah.
So it's relatively small. And with this, people who in 2016 were living in the valley but were born somewhere else, born outside Australia.
See, some of the South Africans could have been Dutch as well.
Sorry?
Some of the South African people that have come here.
Oh, sure.
recently-
When I said European, that's going to be either Dutch or English. The Anglo community of South Africa is either Afrikaner or English. Yeah. So I don't want to obsess on this one slide, but just what that's saying is that for that small chunk of people who were not born locally, they're mostly going to be represented by Brits and Kiwis and a tiny, tiny smattering from a few other places. That's beginning to change. So this is between 2011 and 2016, 2 census points, 5 years apart. Okay, look what's happening. Fewer and fewer people are coming over that 5-year period from the UK and from the Netherlands and from Germany. But we're beginning to see that a shift in the weighting to people from South Africa, India, China and Canada and so on, and also the Philippines. Notice, look at this number. So that's telling us something. These are not Filipino cane workers, okay? These are Filipino women who are coming to work in the domestic services industry.
Quite a lot of them work in aged care.
And many of them find work. They don't come to the country to look for work primarily, but once they're here, their European husband likes them to have an income, and they find work in aged care and similar service industries. Yep. All right. So that's just pointing out that there is a shift going on. It's relatively small, but the traditional source for people coming into the valley who were born overseas had been Northwest Europe. It's beginning to switch to North America and Asia. Not the Middle East, which is a shame for me. Not the Middle East, but North America and Asia and South Africa. But again, not tall, dark, handsome black South Africans, more likely to be European South Africans, I'm guessing. Tend not to be as tall or as handsome or as dark as the Africans. Never mind, yeah, got the point. Okay, so the total overseas born was only about 7%, and it was much the same 5 years earlier. So there's not been any real change. 2.9, 2.6, 4.6, 4.6, whereas overwhelmingly 83% and 88% people in the Clarence Valley were born in Australia, whether their grandparents were Germans or Dutch or whatever. Okay? So there is a slight change, but we're not being swamped by busloads of Chinese, or except at Jacaranda Festival. But I mean, apart from that one blip, we're not being swamped by lots of people from diverse countries of origin. This is just the same point. 2.9% of the people, almost 3% of the people living in the valley came from countries where English was not their first language, which means 97% of people came from places where English was being spoken, even if that means American. Okay, that's for my American friends. Okay, let's think about religious diversity. Doesn't this look fantastic? Okay? The dark teal is Clarence Valley, the grey is Australia. And Anglicans are doing way, way better in the Clarence Valley than across the country as a whole. Actually, so are Catholics, actually. All right. Uniting Church is doing about the same here as it does anywhere. Okay. Christians not further defined. A little bit. Baptists about the same. Very few Buddhists here compared with nationally. More, but not a large number. You're more likely to find a JW in Grafton than in New South Wales. Okay. And despite all the sound and fury and the light effects and so on, you're less likely to find a Pentecostal Christian in Grafton than you are in Sydney. which is not the impression you get. Okay, with the New Life Church and the Riverside Church and the City View Church and the Connect Church at South Brisbane and the True Vine Church and all the rest. A lot of noise and sound and activity, but it's not translating into people saying, I'm one of them.
But it is translating into a surprisingly high number of kids in the schools who are quite vocally out there from that background. I'm surprised by that actually. I thought it would have been higher given what I've seen in the classrooms.
If you're talking about the data at CVAS, 40% no religion, 30% Anglican. That's what the parents put on the form. 15% Catholic.
But the Pentecostal kids are very vocal. So
Yeah, but they are, but they're very few in number.
Yes.
I mean, I grew up in that sort of hard evangelical tradition. You're trained and you're taught to be out there. But actually, they're a noisy few. They don't represent the community. They're not typical of Grafton.
And that was hard.
I just have a make a comment.
Yeah.
I was talking to one of my neighbours during the week who came with young children on Sunday. First time to church, I think. Oh, kids want to know when we can go back again. With the morning tea.
It was the drinks night. Bag of chips. Well, if that's all it takes, we'll buy poppers and salted chips every week. But you've got to get mum and dad out of bed to bring them. Yeah.
Well, can I ask, are the Pentecostal people the same as do they belong to churches that are called Clarence Valley?
Yeah, just another label. Yeah, and you can. Oh, sorry. Yeah, and so this is reflecting what people put on their census form in August 2016, okay, which is 3 years ago. So that's where it was. So 27% or so in the valley claim that they're Anglican. Now we've got 50,000 people, so that means we've got 26,000 people say they're Anglican in the valley. But the good Anglicans, they're out there in the world. You won't find them in church.
Well, it also covers 4 parishes in the Clarence Valley.
3 parishes?
Well, Glenroe would come into there.
No, I don't think it does. But it's not a.
Clarence Valley.
But it's okay. But the Orara Valley, and church-wise, that's a separate district linked with Coffs Harbour. I'm not sure whether or not.
Yeah, but if you were doing your census in Clarence Valley,
there might be a few people in one part of the Orara Valley that have picked up in this data. I'd have to go back and check the footprint for the LGA district. But it's not going to make much difference, and it's not really a viable parish either.
well, 3. Say 3.
Yeah, you've got Maclean, you've got South Grafton and Grafton. They're the parishes. Yeah. Okay, so that's as it was in 2016. This is just for those who want to say how many Mormons, whatever. Okay, so we've got 43 Muslims. We've got 42 pagans. Only 42 pagans in the whole of the Clarence Valley? Or only 42 people prepared to put pagan on the census, okay? 26 witches. 14 Jews. 68 Hindus. 80 Mormons in the valley. I don't know where they hang out. 114 Lutherans. Is there a Lutheran church at Maclean, maybe? I don't think there's a Lutheran church as such in the valley.
There used to be one in Grafton.
No, it used to be, but I don't think there is anymore. Seventh-day Adventists, 135. Anglicans, 13,000. Roman Catholics, 10,000, and so on.
Is there any reference to the Free Presbyterians, or what used to be called the Presbyterian Church of Eastern Australia?
Yeah, Presbyterian and Reformed is one entry. For the census purposes, they collapse that down into one. Remember, we've got 5 Presbyterian churches in Grafton, none of whom talk to each other.
No.
Okay, because they're in slightly different portions of the vineyard. Okay, so the Free Church of Scotland is down Fitzroy Street. That's a parish of the Free Church of Scotland. It's not a local Presbyterian church, even though they're locally present.
I know they're not specifically mentioned in there, but do we have any Quakers in town? I know there are some at Alstonville.
Well, they're not. The only data set I have is what's on the census data.
I know, I just wondered
I've
word of mouth.
seen them around.
Yeah.
They're in our house.
So pulling that down, This is the change that's been going on between 2011 and 2016. Anglicans, Catholics, Presbyterians and Uniting and Baptists and Pentecostal are going backwards, according to the census data between 2011 and 2016. Okay? Now, okay, these are not, this is 0 people, 500 people, 1,000 people, 2,000 people. Okay? Obviously, a bigger group is going to have more numbers of people either dying or leaving. A smaller group is going to have fewer people to leave or to die or whatever.
Or not prepared to
Okay.
handle themselves as some.
So Catholics, Anglicans, Pressies, Uniting and Baptists and even Pentecostals and Salvos are all declining. And the main reason for the different length of the bars is we're talking of 15,000 people or something. So you lose 2%, that's a lot of people. You lose 2% of 100, it's like 2 people leaving. Okay, so it's not a huge number. But all the traditional Christian communities have gone backwards in the last 5 years. Okay? Not just us.
What is the Clarence Valley's population?
About 50,000.
50. Oh, right.
That's the number we've been working with the whole time.
Right.
50,600 and something.
When it was all, before it was all separated, Grafton was about 15.
Grafton now is around about 17,000,
17. So
both
that's
sides of Grafton.
That stayed fairly.
Yeah, in Grafton itself, there's about 2,000 people who claim to be Anglican.
Yeah.
Okay? But, so what we're saying is there are changes. The only group which is showing a change is the Christian not further defined, and that's probably the Pentecostals, although they're choosing no longer to call themselves Pentecostal. They're just saying, I'm just a Christian. I'm not going to give any more details of branding. And that's gone up by about 800 people in that 5-year period. Okay?
And that would be some of those people from the traditional ones that have shifted across.
Yes, some of the Unitings and some of the Baptists in particular have gone into the NFDs, and probably some of the Anglicans. Okay. So again, we get a sense of some movement going on, but the valley is more like Australia was in the 1950s in terms of denominational. Like across Australia as a whole, top of my head, Catholics are about 20%, Anglicans are about 15%, Uniting Church about 8%. Here, it's about 26, 23 and 15%. So we still have a much more traditional religious profile than you would find across New South Wales or across the country as a whole. Okay, that doesn't give us any, that just explains and maps some of the changes that are happening. It doesn't really tell us what we have to do. In terms of then some crime data, because this is another way of looking at some of the dynamics, and the police publish crime data, so we get to see what they're describing is going on in the valley. Some of them I've only got an annual slide, some of them I have trend data. The problem with annual data is if the police really focus on problem A this year, they're going to have a big report. But what we really want to see is the trend over 10 years, whatever, and compare it with the New South Wales. So in terms of ice use, and ice is one of the scariest drugs around, this is the New South Wales thing. Now these scales are all based on 100,000 people, and Clarence Valley is approximately 50,000 people. So we've got to scale that in, okay? So across New South Wales as a whole, it's about 100 people per 100,000 are using ice or have been convicted of using ice. In Grafton, it's very similar, just slightly above the state average. In 2000, December, this is through last year, Maclean, nobody does ice at Maclean, according to this data.
That could be skewed by where they got charged.
Yeah.
Sure. But yeah, they're too mean. Cost too much money. Yeah. Somebody has said to me that's because the people at Yamba are making the ice and they're selling it to the people at South Grafton. Okay. South Grafton has a rate which is 3 times higher than the state average. Okay, now it's not, so it's still only going to be, around about 300 people per 100,000. South Grafton is about 5,000, 6,000 people, so you scale it back down. It's not going to be every kid you walk past in the street is not doing ice, but 3 times higher the state average and twice as high as this side of the river.
And those are just the ones that get caught.
Yeah.
Oh, and this is just the crime stats, not the ones doing it. Remember, they've done research, particularly around Sydney and so on, where they were sampling the ice and other chemical products that had made their way into the sewerage system.
Yeah.
And it actually showed that some of the affluent suburbs where crime rates are officially low, there were nonetheless very high levels of people choosing to pour the drugs down the toilet rather than eat it. Apparently.
And are these charges or convictions? Yeah.
These are incidents of drug offences, use and possession of amphetamine. I couldn't answer.
Yeah. Because if you're in a richer neighbourhood where you can afford a good lawyer, the
Yeah,
conviction rate's likely to be
Yeah,
less.
so these are people that are being charged and, police say we've got an issue here.
Can I interrupt? Alex, I couldn't understand what you said. What did you say?
If you, it matters whether it's a conviction rate or whether it's a charge rate.
Yeah.
Because if you live in a richer neighbourhood, you can be charged, but you might not be convicted because your lawyer was good. So you're a poor person who can't afford that resource to get you off.
Sure. Yeah, and I'm sure that's partly what's going on in South Grafton.
Yeah.
But that's
Okay.
probably going to get worse because the Aboriginal Legal Service is now shifting
Yeah.
out of Grafton.
Yeah. And Yamba is lower than the state average, but not as good as McLean, which is kind of just there.
Yeah, that's good.
Okay, so these are just snapshots. We're not here to have a drug summit, but let's. Okay. The trend data for abuse of amphetamine across the valley from 1995 to 2018. So this gives us a better sense. The blue line is the state average, and the pink or red line is our valley. So it's consistently consistently above the state average, and it's moving as it gets worse in the state, it's getting worse up here.
Yeah.
I have no idea what it means when every 6 months it goes back to 0. I think that's just the way they've drawn the graph. I mean, it can't be that in November 2000 it was, or whatever, September 99 was up here, November 2000 was 0. That doesn't make sense.
The person who enters the stats only works part-time.
But so just look at the overall trend. So there was a particular problem about 20 years ago. I don't know if any of you, I don't mean you were part of the problem, but I don't know if you know about any reports in the media around about 2000, 99, 2000, and obviously, or that was a year when the police really focused on drug abuse. And they rounded up lots of poor people that have been doing drugs.
There was a drug summit about that time, I think.
But so leaving that outlier out, you can see a trend, and the trend is consistently higher use, but it's not getting any better, and it's reflecting the wider data, but at a slightly higher level. Now we go to South Grafton, still amphetamine use. The blue line is the state, and the other jiggly line is South Grafton data. Okay. This is still per 100,000. So you've got to scale it right down. South Grafton is probably only 20% of 100,000. So you've got to, we're not talking of lots and lots of people. But the trend is there. Interestingly, the state trend is not showing the problem is getting worse, despite the political rhetoric around election times. Okay, interesting. It's something around which politicians campaign, but the data is not suggesting that it's blown off the scale. It's trending slightly up, but not hugely.
You see, when they build housing estates that only support low-income people in one area, congregating in one area, that's when you get the high rates of things instead of sprinkling them around everywhere.
Yeah, well, you'll get, this is spread over not one housing estate, this is spread over either, well, it's either a large suburb like South Grafton or it's the whole valley.
But yeah, I was going to say though,
Yeah.
housing commission homes that are all together. I mean,
Sure. Yeah, and then, yeah.
crisis
And so poverty correlates with a number of other things, including health,
that's right.
including crime, including poor educational outcomes, and so on.
So they're all congregated in one
Yeah.
spot. And it makes it
Yep, absolutely.
more problems.
This next slide is looking at domestic violence. And again, McLean and Yamba are lower than the state average in that particular year, which was last year. Grafton is almost twice the state average, and South Grafton is close to 3 times the state average. Again, allowing for the fact we're talking relatively small numbers of people. So domestic violence, of course, correlates with social disadvantage, poverty, health, alcohol, drugs, and so on. This is the trend data, again, just in South Grafton, from 2011 to 2018. There's the state data in the blue line, and the South Grafton data is consistently way above the state average. Now, you could presumably, if I had enough time, I could have tracked down similar charts for Yamba, McLean, whatever, but I'm just going with some that are more readily available to me.
And even if it, at its lowest points, it's still escalating upwards.
Yeah, well, it's actually not going, it's not going through the ceiling in South Grafton.
I mean, even at its lowest points, Greg,
Yeah.
the trend at south is still going up. See, it's starting to be above the
Yeah,
blue
yeah,
line
yeah, yeah,
rather
I see
than
what
below
you
the
mean,
blue line.
Yeah, up here, and so on. Yeah, and I'm not sure that the lowest points are anything other than just the line going back to 0. Although then why isn't it like down here? So yeah, I don't quite understand what's going on with that line. I would have preferred them just to have a line that joined the dots across the top rather than a totally different graphic, which I'm finding a bit confusing. But we can see that what it's saying is, not just in South Grafton, but particularly in South Grafton, there are some challenges around domestic assault. This is adult victims of alcohol-related assault, but not necessarily domestic assault. Now, you had to get a copper to explain.
And
That's just beating up random women, but not women in the home. Maybe. I mean, I'm not quite sure what's going on there.
I think this one includes the blokes.
Adult
Domestic
female
violence.
victims
This is-
with alcohol-related assault. Oh, no, it does still say domestic assault in brackets on residential premises.
Oh.
So this is home-based domestic assault of women, where alcohol is a factor rather than stress over gambling debts or something else. Okay, so just a particular slice. Again, New South Wales state average is about 180 people per 100,000. South Grafton is just over 400 per 100,000. Grafton it's about 200. So what we're consistently seeing is a differential between this side of the river and the other side of the river, which points to underlying long-term issues, which everybody who lives in Grafton knows about. But I mean, that's to what extent is that something that South Grafton Parish and Grafton Parish could be doing something about? Could be putting our hearts together and saying, what can we do here? Yamba actually is interestingly high, and McLean, very different data. Okay, push it along, we're up to the hour. And this is domestic violence where alcohol is not involved. The data's not much different.
We have to go, sorry.
Okay. So whether alcohol is involved or not, the data is much the same. This is assault in selected suburbs. Now Grafton's coming into our own. Okay. So there are almost as many cases of assault reported in Grafton as reported in South Grafton. Okay. And well above the state average, whereas McLean and Yamba are roughly the state average. So there's something going on there about violence and assault, but not particularly domestic assault. Again, the trend data, this is from 2011. You can see what's happening. We're consistently above the state average and at times dramatically above the state average. So this is not just 1 year. This is a year on year on year on year on year trend of assault. And this is Grafton, not South Grafton. arson. Data speaks for itself. Again, that's 300 cases per 100,000. There's only 5,000 people in South Grafton, so it's not going to be houses burning down every week. But there's a significantly high, whereas Grafton, Maclean, and even less, Yamba, are closer to the state average. Arson is a much bigger problem in South Grafton. Sexual offences, indecent assault, acts of indecency and other sexual offences, state average, about 100 per 100,000, 3 times that rate in South Grafton. Roughly the state average in Grafton. Interesting, a little bit higher. I mean, up until now, Maclean has been the nice, clean suburb. But maybe not. What have they got under their kilt? Yeah. Weapons offences. Prohibited and regulated weapons in select. This is from, this is back in 2017. Again, there's no surprise in this data. Less likely to occur in Yamba, much more likely to occur in South Grafton, and even in Grafton and Maclean, weapons offences are a little bit higher than the state average. Okay, so that's the data. We've talked about how many of us are there, where do we come from, what do our families look like, what do our educational achievements look like, what's our workplace data looking like, and then we've looked at some of that, what's our religious profile looking like, and then we've looked at some of the data which points to problems, whether that be drugs, alcohol, violence, assault, arson, and so on. Okay?
We didn't do homelessness, did we?
Sorry?
We didn't do homelessness.
I just didn't have data on it. Yeah. But you know, there's any number of issues we could look at.
Oh, yeah.
You also, there's no data here about nasty things being said to the handful of people who are not of Anglo background, because that data is not going to be reported much, and it's not going to find its way into the census data, which I was relying on. We need other avenues of data to find that. So homelessness will be another one. We've looked at youth unemployment. Homelessness would clearly be another issue. Affordable housing, we've got the data from Anglicare, which we had last month, from Estelle, so we know that the issues around affordable housing and homelessness to a certain extent factors into that. And my guess is it tends to correlate with what we've been talking about here. So the final page on your kind of worksheet is for you to come up with questions and issues you would like Parish Council to be addressing. It's basic, it's a version of the SWOT analysis. What are the principal needs in our community is one of the boxes. So I think there's a separate page right at the back, isn't there? No, one more page maybe?
Yes.
Oh, yeah. Sheets of paper have 2 sides. Yeah. I was sure I'd run it off. But, yeah. So we don't have time to go through this today, but I'd really encourage you to say, well, okay, out of all of that, what emerges are the principal needs in our community? Okay, there are some issues there. So what are they? What are the opportunities for us in our mission as Anglicans, given our 5 marks of mission include responding to need, dealing with violence, and caring for the environment. That's 3, 4, 5 from the marks of mission. So what are our opportunities as Anglicans here in Grafton and across the valley? What can we be doing about it? What are the major challenges and threats that we face as we try to do that? Now, for example, we're not getting any younger. There aren't very many of us left to do this work. We can all think of reasons that are going to make it hard to do anything and have much impact. But we do have some resources, including the school, including partnerships with the City Council, with the Clarence Valley Council, with Multicultural New South Wales, with the police, with Headspace, and so on, with the School of Arts at South Grafton, etc., etc. Do we need to be talking with the focus of Matthews to say, look, this is too big a problem for us to say, look, we're on this side of the river. Yeah, is this something we can be doing? Is there stuff we can be doing together where we can help each other to develop programs or whatever to address some of this? And then out of all the things we could do, and and should do, which are the issues that we're going to choose to address in the next 2 or 3 years, because we can't tackle everything, but are there 1 or 2 things that just kind of float to the surface? And look, that is such an issue, and so many people are being hurt by this. We've just got to find a way of doing something, whatever it might happen to be. Now, to do that properly, we of course would need to take the rest of the day to continue unpacking all this. But I hope the content from last month about homelessness and housing and other forms of social disadvantage which Anglicare addresses, and of course Anglicare are one of the assets we have. It's not just us and South Grafton and the school, but also Anglicare. We have a pretty significant set of assets that we could be, and the op shops both here and across the river, St Matthews. We've got assets we could be deploying more intentionally to make Grafton and the Clarence Valley a healthier and happier and more blessed place. And I'd be saying that is the work of God in this valley, okay, which we have to be doing in some way. The question is, how do we do it? What programs do we set up or support? And what resources can we find to put into it? Okay?
Can I just ask a question before people disperse?
Certainly.
Apart from me, is there anyone from South Grafton in the Cathedral Parish?
Yes. A couple of people in the choir as well, and a few others. And you'll find some folk who go to St Matthews and live on this side of the river, but yeah, there are. So traditionally it was, I think, more bifurcated, but these days people have either connections with the community over there or here, or they like the music here, or they don't like the music here, so they go, yeah, there are all kinds of reasons. And some projects, like the bookshop, are very much, the volunteers come from both St Matthews and here, as well as other places, whereas the op shops, I'm guessing, are more locally staffed. Assuming St Matthews has their own op shop, I don't imagine there's anybody from St Matthews volunteering here, and vice versa.
We have a big help of volunteers in our op shop from the community who are related to, don't come to church more or less, and that's lovely.
Yeah.
Weren't they going to talk about a police youth association for kids to keep them active, and wasn't there?
PCYC.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wasn't that supposed to be happening?
It is happening.
It is happening.
Yeah, so I mean, some of these things are things that are happening, and that's where part of any moving forward in any of this, we'd have to be also then not thinking we're the only people worrying about this stuff. There are other people in the community that are also, they can read the data, they can see what's going on, and so they have, a few years ago, maybe 3 to 4 years ago, there was a major issue with youth suicide around town and in the valley. That got addressed. There's a Clarence Valley mental health, community health service that has done a really good job of addressing some of that stuff. Clearly there are still issues, so talking to the police, talking to the schools, talking to other youth organisations like Headspace and so on, without just having a rolling series of summits where we talk about the problem but never get around to doing anything about the problem. That's not going to be helpful either. But this is not just a Grafton Cathedral problem. These are issues in Grafton, they're issues in the valley, and we are one of the community actors who could contribute in certain areas if we work out
for example,
priorities
Lenore Parker might be invited to have special services every now and again. You know, things like that.
And we didn't really address issues around First Nations people, but again, they correlate dramatically with unemployment, with school, non-completion rates at school, juvenile justice participation, and so on. And certainly the people that Sam works with through her school transition program, overwhelmingly Indigenous young people. So it's great that she's doing it. but it's not good that it's overwhelmingly an Indigenous issue. It's bad enough that it exists, but the fact that it's disproportionately affecting one community is not good. So there's a conversation to be had. Parish Council is one of the places where the conversation will come to an action point, but I'd really encourage people to work through the data. I mean, you also know, you've got your own impressions about what's going on in town and around the valley. The question is, how do we, instead of averting our eyes and saying it's not our problem, are there any of these things which we can make a difference to?
So you want us to get the spreadsheet back to you?
They're welcome to come back to me, or come back to the office, probably in the first instance, and encourage others. I mean, the PowerPoint is on the Cathedral website, so people who aren't here can still download the PowerPoint and watch it. This has been recorded as well. This session's been recorded, so this session will be on there if people just want to watch it.
We can share it on Facebook.
You can share it on Facebook, you can pass it to friends or whatever. For me, the question is, I'm learning more about the place where we are, which is a place where most of you will be for various amounts of time. And the Cathedral, it seems to me, doesn't connect well with many of those points of need. Now, it doesn't mean if we start doing something, that will not translate into dozens of domestic violence victims suddenly thinking, I want to be in church on Sunday morning. It's not going to be a program about numbers. It's a program about how we serve God's mission in our community. There's no point running programs that might work at Tweed Heads, for instance, but they're just not relevant in Grafton. So we've got to come up with what needs to be done in our community, and which of our resources can realistically be directed into those areas of need. Try and make a difference, give people hope. Okay?